Hello guys, I would like to talk about the philosophy of Jedis. To be more specifically, I would like to talk about how prequels kind of ruined the philosophy of Jedis, and I think that prequels actually have pretty good writing overall. The biggest problem with prequels writing is the OT. And I would like to talk about the clash of the ideas and the way it kind of contradicts not lore specifically, but the ideas that Jedi want to pursue. I was kind of motivated to do this video because of this video posted by Carl earlier today, Carl Benjamin, also known as Sargon of Akkad, on his, I don't know, fifth channel probably at this point, as his side channel called Symposium. I will definitely link the video below, where he basically discusses how the Jedi philosophy is an absolute mess because it's an inconsistent nonsense, really, of a jihadi cult, which out of what we're given in prequels is not a far-fetched theory. And the other reason why I really wanted to do this video is because of the EFAP's discussion of a couple of, I think it was 2 releases before, how they were talking about, they were comparing the writing in sequels and prequels, and I knew that there was something fundamentally wrong with the writing in the prequels that I wanted to pinpoint, but I couldn't really because sequels are written horribly. Sequels are just bad in every single possible way. They ruin the lore, they don't expand on the lore, not in any good way at least. This balance of the Force is a complete misunderstanding of everything we were shown prior to this. But they're just bad in every way. The prequel writing is bad in a very odd, more nuanced, and more philosophical way. I know how much the EFAP crowd, for instance, doesn't like talking about the themes, but I will talk about the themes, just that I will use them differently. Mostly the way movie themes matter. Themes in any narrative matter. There is a reason why the story is being told, and it's better if you can get the reason of why the story is being told. The problem with the themes in the modern movies, a lot of modern movies, is first, if an author wants to throw in an author should have a theme, should not have a theme in his head immediately when he starts writing the story. When the author is trying to make a point in the story, it's kind of missing the point of the story. And a lot of authors try to just make some pretentious themes included into their movies that are written poorly and make them all of a sudden, hope that that makes them all of a sudden good. It doesn't. No amount of themes in Rise of Skywalker will make that movie good. No amount of themes in The Last Jedi will make that movie good. And the themes that are in that movie are pretty horrendous, on the nose, and obviously consciously put in there. And what I'm trying to say when I say that the author should not have an idea before he starts the story and should not try to put an idea he already has to put into the story is that, generally speaking, one of the key aspects of what art actually is useful for in societies is art is a kind of a measure of what's going on in the society, a kind of measurement for the tendencies in the society, where the wind is blowing, let's call it that way. And that's true for any kind of art. And generally speaking, this is achieved only by an artist being more sensible to the change without the capacity to actually put that change into word. Because to actually quantize it, to actually identify the change is one thing, and it's not always useful. It's very inefficient to spread as an information in a sense, because you've got to be very sophisticated and have a very sophisticated understanding of not only the ideas but also the language that you're trying to actually portray this with. Whereas you can always use this story way of telling these ideas that you might not understand yourself. And true art usually uses the stories to answer the ideas they don't understand. They don't have an idea and then they just pretentiously spend $200 million into putting that stuff into film with action scenes and God knows whatnot. You have an idea, you have a question, you have a feeling that something needs answering, and then you just try to write a story around it and you try to answer that question in the story. That's what made Dostoevsky that great. Dostoevsky's all of his works are basically based on this idea. And so is most of good art, really. Jordan Peterson likes talking about this, and there is a big point of how it's very odd that this point is actually contradicted with George Lucas, because he actually knew of this when he was writing the OT. Jordan Peterson talks how, and it's not necessarily his idea, at least I don't think it's his idea, but maybe it's this clear manifestation is his idea, so I'll credit him. We use stories for very specific reasons. We use stories when we try to we use stories really to make a point that we cannot phrase yet, to convey an idea that we cannot yet put to words properly. It's how we use an example when we cannot really just quantify something. It's how we use an example instead of actually making an argument a lot of the times, but in a much more sophisticated way. And usually the stories make a very intricate philosophical argument. And this really kind of goes back into the monomyth, right? The hero story, which, like, everybody likes to credit Campbell with that idea, but I think that a lot of people miss what Jung actually done for that. Because Carl Jung actually, he pretty much expanded on that point. He originated with the idea, he summarized the idea of the monomyths, the idea of the same stories repeating from culture to culture. No matter how many cultures we're talking about, no matter where those cultures were originated, there are some specific similarities between the stories. One of the clearest similarities is the hero story, but it's not the only similarity between those stories, really. And Carl Jung actually talked about the expanded meaning of all these archetypes. Basically speaking, and in a classical story, a story like Lord of the Rings, for instance, would be an amazing example. All the characters are not only characters, and of course they still have to be characters, and there still has to be some sense to the story, so we actually submerge ourselves into the story. But all the characters are still supposed to be people, but that's their kind of secondary function in a sense of the narrative itself, of the meta-narrative, to be more precise. So the narrative has to be sound for the story to be interesting, but the meta-narrative is something in the lines of all these characters combined create a super character, meaning all the characters in the story are archetypes representing one or the other kind of archetype, an archetype that will actually summarize into a human being's psyche. Let me give you an example. For instance, the more modern way of writing things, the less naive way of writing things, as is commonly referred to, is like the way we have it in the Game of Thrones, the more realistic way of portraying everything, where good and bad is combined in every human being. There is no clear evil, there is no clear good. Well, at least there wasn't for the first several seasons, huh? But honestly, in the end, everything is clear bad. But the point with those kind of stories is that not everybody is the same, and how, for instance, what's his face, the guy who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. God, I'm not gonna remember that right now. How he put it pretty accurately, I would say, the line between good and evil lies in the middle of every human being's heart. But the thing about it is that old simplistic meta-narrative stories actually kind of mean the same thing. It's just that all the characters, the absolute evil characters and the absolute good characters, are all representation of the same psyche, the psyche of the story that goes on. The good characters are the positive sides of the psyche, and the bad characters are the negative sides of the psyche. And this is the argument that Jung was actually coming up with. So, and once again, Star Wars actually was based on this argument. The original trilogy was based on the Campbell's monomyth, definitely. And Campbell's monomyth was based on Jung's work. And it's actually even closer to the Jung's works, with all the save the father figure, going to the dungeon, all these more specific psychological ideas that Jung had, ideas that are way too complicated to unpack right now, and I'm not sure I'm even up to the task for that. But basically, the whole point with that idea and going on from that idea would be that the original trilogy clearly established something very interesting. It established the world in a tyrannical state, where there's a tyrannical government that is corrupt, the same way that we have a tyrannical government throughout the middle section of Lion King, for instance. The same way we have a tyrannical government trying to take over the entirety of the chaos that was the Middle Earth during the Lord of the Rings saga. Tyranny of a government, tyranny of order, is always going to be opposed by chaos. And tyranny of chaos, or dangers of chaos, which usually doesn't lead to tyranny, are always opposed by the order. The idea being, the Jungian idea being that we're always at our best when we're one leg into unknown and one leg on the solid ground of the known. And that an order without some chaos will stagnate and turn into tyranny, and pure chaos is uncontrollable and dangerous. And we all understand this to some level in our back, in the back of our head, of course. And all these ideas end up turning into something like this. Now, in the original trilogy, we're given the absolute order of the empire. Order is not emotional. Order is not based on emotion, to be more precise. Order is based on cold, bureaucratic, stagnated, bureaucratic, maybe not the best word, old, tyrannical order especially, or old, bureaucratic, stagnated, malicious ideas that are rooted in order and obedience to the order and tyranny over everybody, and actually the opposite of what we're told in the stories, in prequels, and suspension of emotions. Now, if the order is a suspension of emotions, it doesn't mean that there's no fear-mongering. For instance, order can use fear-mongering, and that was the idea put in the original trilogy, with the fear being a thing of the Sith. It still stays sound in that case, that the fear is an idea of, it's a Sith idea. It's an idea that Sith used to weaponize fear-mongering, controlling, fear-mongering for control, all those kind of ideas. Everything that we know comes from control. We see that in families, we see that in parents and their children, of course. We see that with tyrannical governments, misinformation, fear, all those things are used for the power of the tyranny. So it wasn't contradicted that, and it wasn't contradicted then in the OT. And the OT, actually, in the OT, Jedi stood for self-improvement, individualism, for the sovereignty of an individual, I would say, in a big way. The Jedi was a stoic person that was improving himself, that was not allowing himself to be subjugated to the tyranny, that was not allowing himself to go into a panic mode and fear and hide under the tyrannical rule that will guide your whole life and tell you exactly what to do and where to go. And of course, it was also for bravery, and it was one leg at least into chaos, because it's a rebellion. The rebellion is not a well-organized structure by any stretch of an imagination, and it's summarizing this unknown, and unknown always is based in chaos. Once again, it's a very Jungian idea. That's why a hero leaves the order to go to unknown, find something in that unknown. That's the most simple idea. That's the most simple way that the monomyth pays out, that the hero story pays out. A hero leaves his comfort zone, his order, into the unknown to find something new, unknown, into the unknown, right? Into the chaos to find something new, unknown. Tammer it, fight with it, understand it, and come back with that knowledge, and share it with his populace. That's, once again, hero myths can also say the other way around, how the hero finds out something in the unknown and then comes back and, for instance, gets rid of the tyranny. That's the entire story of Moses, for crying out loud. These stories, they're everywhere. As far as you can go back, all these archetypes of the stories and these beats of the stories, they stay there. And it's really difficult to make a new story that's going to be anything but Bob went and bought ice cream. Any story with a meaning usually has these ideas. These are the real themes. That this eternal struggle of understanding these ideas that we cannot comprehend mostly, and we cannot really put to words. Nobody really specifically put these ideas to words. Only was possible to give an example of. Jung did the best job that I think anybody could have done, and even then, it's like kind of a mess when you read through it. I mean, you know what he's trying to say, but I don't think he actually specifically says it. That's the problem of why we need the stories to communicate ideas that we cannot really put into a proper structuralized sentence, something that we cannot identify and quantize and categorize, I would say. So what are we looking at with this story then? Well, this is actually, by the way, the only idea that the sequels got right. The one scene that was actually done right in the sequels. Let me just show it to you guys over here.
At the height of their powers, they allowed Darth Sidious to rise, create the Empire, and wipe them out. It was a Jedi Master who was responsible for the training and creation of Darth Vader.
And a Jedi who saved him.
It's the only idea. The only idea in the entirety of the sequels that's worth its salt. Because it actually gets the contradiction. The tyrannical order being fought off by an individual who found something in the unknown, some ancient knowledge, something that actually could save the civilization. That monomythical story. And that something being, of course, the Force. And going out of his way to actually pursue the Force, save his father, all the standard beats of the monomyth. I'm sure if anybody of you guys listened to some of, or read some of Jordan Peterson, you've heard all of these ideas a million times. But the prequels completely undermined all of these ideas. And that's the biggest problem with the writing in the prequels. Absolutely, undoubtedly the biggest problem with the writing in the prequels. The prequels show us the Jedis, this ancient knowledge, this faction, as a faction of an absolute power. Sorry, absolute tyranny. No deviation from the core, no deviation from the status quo. Nothing. We have a dogma, and the dogma has to be conserved. No arguments, no questions about it. And that's the biggest problem with the original trilogy, with the prequel trilogy. That they show us, they portray the Jedi as the carriers of the order. Instead of it, they twisted it, instead of it being the story, instead of it being that mystical unknown, the eternal harmony found in the chaos that was an antidote to chaos, an antidote to order. Quite like the opposite of the Jordan Peterson's book, The Antidote of Chaos, right? They took that idea and they just flipped it on top of its head. No, that thing actually was responsible for the order in the galaxy for God knows how long. That thing actually created the stagnation that was undermined by the tyranny. That was the same bloody thing that created the stagnation. Moreover, the big problem thematically is that a part of chaos, an unknown source, part of the chaos has actually some emotional connotations to it. It's usually not the hard, structured science. It's usually the emotional part of the things. And this is where we completely messed up. Well, George Lucas kind of messed up. I don't want to say this arrogantly, but he did. The idea of the chaos that he was presenting in the original... No, sorry. The idea of the chaos that he was presenting in the original talked about emotion and how emotions are not the way of the Jedi. Not in a sense of actual emotions generally, but instead of in a sense of fear, instead of anger. All those things that, once again, tyrannical governments usually use, tyrannical orders usually use of any magnitude. It can be, once again, a family abuse. It can be a government. It can be anything at any scale. Any tyranny uses fear and anger and all the negative emotions. And it was a sound idea. But in prequels, this statement became all emotions. Jedi are supposed to be completely non-emotional, 100% stoic in all conditions, constantly use only reason and never use their emotions. And that's as structured and as orderly as it gets. We've never went past that orderly system. Like, there was nowhere to make it more orderly than that. And all those orders, by the way, always failed. All the orders completely based on reason always fail. They're horrible. And the way it's portrayed in the prequels, how the order of reason fails, completely sound, once again, from the metacritical standpoint, from the meta narrative standpoint, it's completely sound. That's why if those movies were actually standalone movies, it wouldn't make that much of a thematical clash. I'm not saying that it would fix all the problems with the prequels. There's a gazillion problems with the prequels outside of that particular part in the script. But that's, I think, the biggest point of the plot, the biggest point of the narrative itself that they missed. Not the clunky dialogue. That's horrible. Not the cardboard characters. They're horrible too. Especially Padme, oh my god. But the biggest problem was specifically this point, I think, in the prequels, that they flipped this on top of its head. They flipped every narrative predisposition, every part of the archetype, and every archetypical point of the story on its head in the prequels. Which, once again, the story is actually pretty sound. Not the execution, but the story itself is pretty sound. But it just doesn't work with the first story. It doesn't work with what we know about the Force. And I think that has kind of clashed in everybody's back of their head. Everybody who watched the prequels at some point had this idea in the back of their head of, I thought the Jedis were representing this archetype, and we all understand that archetype. And somewhere in the back of our heads, we all do. And no, it doesn't. Now we find out that it doesn't. It represents this weird thing. Like the way that I would say Yoda, for instance, would be comparable, in the OT, of course, would be comparable to Zazu, I think? No, not Zazu, what am I saying? The monkey from the Lion King. It's the representation of self, of perfect self, throughout the times, of your maximum potential. He was the representation of maximum potential of Luke. This incredibly wise, kind of funny, incredibly powerful person who was trying to teach him. It wasn't a mentor, it was the representation, I would say, of what he can be. Well, not him particularly, but the meta-narrative of where the meta-narrative is going to. And what do we see in prequels? Some kind of a bureaucrat dedicated to order. Order that obviously stagnates. This is a very serious, just as well as Luke's, and this applies to the entire Force and the entirety of Jedis, of course, just as well as Luke in the sequel trilogy was a complete mess, because it's not Luke, it's Jake Skywalker, as we all know. A complete mess and a complete betrayal of the character. This has the same kind of a beat. It wasn't a complete betrayal of a character, but it was a complete betrayal of what the character's position was in the meta-narrative, definitely. And his position can change in the meta-narrative. His position can change in the narrative, but it should not change in the meta-narrative. What that character represents, and what that idea of the Force represents, should not change from the prequels. That's, I think, the biggest problem. Or it could have been challenged, but it wasn't challenged. It was completely switched on its own top. And I think that would be basically the idea that I was trying to portray, as clunkily as I did it, and however many minutes I did it. And hope you guys found it interesting. Just wanted to share this idea.